Connect New York is brought to you by JLL, Lend-Lease, and is powered by Unisu. Robert Friedman discusses how BIM technology and prefab are transforming the construction industry.
Robert Friedman, co-founder and CEO of Tech Prefab. I'm speaking to you now less than a mile from the Empire State Building, which stands 103 stories tall. It's about 1,250 feet to the top floor. It took about 3 months to excavate. So guess how long it took to construct? That's correct, about 13 months. And at completion in April of 1931, it was the tallest building in the world. So that was about 90 years ago. If you were building it today, it would probably take about 5 years, at least. And the truth is, construction hasn't changed much in the last century, until now. Which leads us right into our topic. How is technology transforming the construction industry? To really answer that question in New York fashion, we of course need to ask another question. What are the key challenges facing building today? Well, the first challenge of building is simple. We need more of them, especially buildings for people to live in. Population growth and low housing production have created a global housing crisis. About 850 million people, more than the combined population of the United States and the EU, live in what they call informal settlements, which sounds something like relaxed neighborhood, but it's actually the technical name for illegal and inadequate housing, not built to any code, and often with no reliable access to basic utilities like potable water, utilities, or sanitation. In other words, we're talking about slums, shantytowns, squats, and in too many cases, flat-out homelessness. Now, here in the US, the number of households which are cost-burdened, which means that 30% of their income, and in some cases 50% of their income, is spent on housing, is rapidly growing and has reached about 21 million people, almost half the renters in our country. That's not just in big cities, by the way, like New York, where we are now, or San Francisco, or Los Angeles, or even tech hubs like Seattle or Portland. All these cities have an oversupply of luxury housing and an undersupply of affordable housing. And just like in the developing world, where you see those shanty towns, unfortunately, there are a lot of homeless encampments in these cities. But it's not even the cities. We're also talking about the rural areas and the tertiary cities in the United States. And in all these places, it's not just a crisis for the least advantaged among us, but also for the working and middle class, and even for the Gen Yers and the millennials. One housing report says the United States market needs a whopping 7.3 million new homes to fully meet demand that we are facing. And now, at one point in the early 2000s, new home construction did outpace demand, but then came the financial crisis, and builders pulled back, as we know. Since then, we've had an economic recovery of sorts, and housing starts have picked up again, but housing growth has been anemic, in part due to zoning constraints, but also because of construction costs. And that is a good segue to the second challenge for construction. We talked about the global shortage in the face of growing demand, at least for the household sector, but the flip side of that is growing building costs. And there are a bunch of reasons for that. Material costs are up, not to mention trade wars and their tariffs. Labor costs are up even more, for a variety of reasons. Let's start with the aging population. Looking back at the 2008 recession again, 600,000 workers left construction jobs, never to return. And while silver-haired skilled tradespeople are retiring, new entrants to job market avoid construction jobs because they see them as dangerous, difficult, or dirty. Members of Gen Y and Z of all income backgrounds entering the workforce today would prefer to go to a 4-year college or take on jobs in retail or transportation, anything but construction. They may wear construction boots when it's a style, but not because they're heading to a job site. In the US alone, there are over 400,000 vacant jobs, according to the government, and that forces contractors to pay subcontractors higher wages, which is not a bad thing, but it also becomes part of a dangerous, self-reinforcing cycle, which has at least 7 parts. This is why I went to business school. Rising construction costs reduce the supply of new housing because they shift marginally while residential development goes into the red. So there becomes a bias towards luxury because people don't want to build the less expensive housing. That results in housing costs going up. That in turn feeds into the construction wage growth. Because when housing prices rise, the workers themselves require a greater compensation in order to take care of their own needs. And then the supply of homes becomes smaller. than it would be otherwise. So what you have is it becomes harder then for people to find suitable homes for sale. And then this creates a greater incentive for people to renovate their homes. And that puts pressure on labor costs because renovations are harder to do than ground-up construction. So then housing prices rise again. And then the pool of potential home buyers who are doing these renovations are probably selected based on their finances, and they seem to have higher expectations for what those renovations will be. They are looking for better levels of finishes. So once again, you've got the additional renovations taking place, and you also start with the home flippers. That pushes prices up, and then you have higher labor costs again, and you have a supply of housing that's reduced. And the cycle continues, rinse and repeat. Now, there is not just an issue with housing shortages, as I've outlined, and these rising construction costs, and these things feed off each other. But if that wasn't bad enough, there's been a third challenge facing the construction industry today, and that is below average productivity. It's kind of like the diner in a restaurant who complained that the food is so expensive and the portions are so small. On the one hand, we're talking about one of the largest industries in the world economy, at about 13% of global GDP and roughly $10 trillion a year. On the other hand, even though that's a lot of money and that's a lot of building, the industry's productivity has trailed other sectors. Take here, for example, in the US, American builders' productivity has plunged by half since the late 1960s. A few years ago, McKinsey reported that construction sector labor productivity growth has only averaged 1% a year over the prior 2 decades, and in some areas it's actually declined. Now, if you compare that with an increase of 2.8% for the total world economy's productivity and 3.6% productivity increases for the manufacturing sector, so you're looking at a very dismal situation for construction. And if you look at the graph, you can see that the lowest line there, that bottom red line, is construction. So poor labor productivity in construction is one of the main reasons for cost overruns, for projects falling behind, and it also increases financing costs when you have those delays. And it also increases, in the case of buildings for rent, it increases the period of time where they're not collecting that rent, so your income goes down. McKinsey also reports that large projects across asset classes, so not just housing, but any asset classes, typically take 20% longer to finish than scheduled and are up to 80% over budget. There are lots of reasons for all of this, only some of which are on this slide, which is designed with very small fonts to show you that there are lots of reasons. From the labor shortages we discussed earlier to high turnover, fatigue on the job, and an important one to highlight, which we did, is that 82% of owners feel that they need more collaboration with their contractors, which just may be related to the stat that 60% of construction companies are not investigating any new technologies due to lack of support, budget concerns, and employee hesitance. It sort of makes sense that if you're open to new technologies, you may increase your productivity. So we've discussed 3 main challenges facing the construction industry today: housing shortages, rising building costs, and the issue of labor productivity, or the decline in it. Obviously, these 3 factors position the construction industry as ripe for disruption. And fortunately, there actually has been a lot of innovation, particularly over the last few years, which brings us to the OP, or the original post, as they say in social media. How is technology transforming the construction industry? There are all kinds of innovations that are being introduced. Access to groundbreaking technologies are becoming relatively easier and cheaper. There are reality capture scanners, AR, VR, MR. There are devices that people are using to walk around construction sites to take inventory and to signal problems, sort of like GoPro cameras that construction workers are wearing on their helmets. All kinds of innovations are happening. I want to focus on one area in construction technology innovation, and that's visual representation. I want to go through the history of architecture in 3 slides and hopefully 30 seconds. The first depictions of classical architecture were discovered in Italy during the 15th century, when a copy of a book by the 1st century Roman architect Vitruvius was unearthed in Rome. The next big breakthrough took place in the 1950s. Of course, there were a lot of iterations between the 1st century and the 1950s, but I'm trying to give you the big picture in a very short amount of time. And that was what we call CAD, computer-aided design, in which you design buildings on workstations at first and then on computers to not only visually create and represent, but also to analyze and to optimize designs and to increase the productivity of the designer and improve the quality of design, improve the communications through documentation, and to start to create a database for manufacturing. Which brings us to a third evolution, which enhanced the digitization of the built environment in a major way, well beyond what CAD has done. And of course, we're talking about BIM, or Building Information Modeling. And what you're looking at now is a BIM representation of Le Corbusier's Villa Savoye. So what is BIM? BIM is defined by a growing number of dimensions, usually 6 or 7 if you look at the charts on the internet, but I found one that had 10. As a design transitioned from CAD to BIM, architects could now create 3D digital twin models of buildings which could simulate and therefore measure all kinds of things, not just visually, but behaviorally. It covers spatial relationships. It covers light analysis, the way energy and water flows in a particular project, and also geographical information. And you get all sorts of information about a building that becomes a basis then for the decisions during a building's life cycle, from the earliest conception to the operation, maintenance, and even, if you look at the 10-dimension graph, to demolition. What kind of information am I talking about? Quantity, cost of building materials, components, manufacturers, details, and schedules. So with all this, you can understand how technology is beginning to tackle the 3 challenges of construction. But there's a 4th challenge. In the US, construction and demolition debris are one of the biggest sources of landfill waste, with estimates as much as 40% of all solid waste, of which only about 20% of that solid waste is recycled. Doing a better job with construction and debris can make a big dent in reducing our need for landfills. Similarly, residential and commercial buildings account for 40% of total energy consumption, according to the government. And just to put things into context, cars produce a fraction of the carbon that buildings do. There's a lot about the construction we're seeing. It's complicated, expensive, and frankly messy. BIM can go a long way in terms of changing the construction process and how people work together, but we believe prefab builds on all the innovation of BIM and uniquely takes it to the next level to solve the environmental problems as well as the other 3 problems. And of course, unlike conventional construction where builders can only start construction after the site work is done and then are subject to outdoor weather conditions, building in a controlled environment in parallel with the site work, it reduces delays, it reduces waste, and lowers your costs. With prefab, we use repeatable processes, standard building components, and other manufacturing methods that bring construction into high productivity world like cars and other products. Now, Prius, when they're selling you a car, it doesn't send a whole team of mechanics and engineers to your house to build a car. They have repeatable processes, and they're using materials that are purchased in bulk, and they're able to customize it to some degree to your purchase. Now, we believe that buildings should be designed, built, and delivered in the same way. At Tech Prefab, our goal is to build faster, less expensive, and greener than conventional construction. Tech Prefab is at the cutting edge of real estate industry's long-awaited embrace of innovation and digitization. Tech Prefab has created a global construction ecosystem that transforms the traditional complex and costly building delivery into an efficient and transparent set of quality processes. We're constantly testing new technologies to integrate into our system with the aims of reducing water, sewer, power, and aiming towards net zero energy and hopefully one day even net carbon status. Powered by our intuitive cloud-based platform, which is called BIMport, the entire project group, the developers, the architects, the tenants, if there are, the contractors, the engineers, can design, collaborate, source materials in real time from a global supply chain, and assemble buildings without cost overruns, without change orders that kill profits of real estate projects, and without delays and headaches. And that allows all of us to focus on what we do best, which is creating superior buildings for people to live, work, and play in. And that goes from ADUs, which we have done and delivered into the US, to single-family homes, to multifamily, and even large commercial buildings. We want to be able to bring them to life in a way that doesn't hurt the environment and that reduces time and costs. The BIMport dashboard is a simple-to-use not just for trained tech architects and engineers, but even for simple laymen who happen to be part of the team that's developing a project, for them to make comments on what is imported into the system, which could be a Revit drawing or any other BIM developed volumetric 3D picture, or any documents that are put into the system. No matter how complex the project, BIMport becomes a very powerful communication tool for everyone relevant to the project. So we can solve the challenges of construction if we're open to new technology and if we take advantage of the tools that will enable us to both collaborate around those solutions and help us build a better world. By 2050, there will be nearly 10 billion of us on the planet. Decent housing is a key driver for well-being among people and even among countries. It could transform people's lives in a very real way. So we're glad to be part of the solution, as we like to call it, the tech prefab solution or revolution. Please check out our website, techprefab.com. Thank you.